In 1889, two national figures who defined the destiny of India for decades to come were born a few months apart from each other, Jawaharlal Nehru and Hedgewar. While Nehru, of course, went on to become the Prime Minister of India, Hedgewar founded a socio-cultural organization called the RSS, of course, which is perhaps arguably the biggest voluntary organization in the world and which has defined India's destiny according to many, surprisingly, but he has. Yet, very little is known about Hedgewar himself. Over the last few years, one can argue that V.D. Savarkar has sort of evoked a lot of interest among academics and among journalists, media people in general. But Hedgewar has got less attention even in the last few years. Sachin Nanda has now written a definitive biography on Hedgewar, and this happens at a very important, very crucial time when the RSS completes 100 years. So, Sachin, congratulations for the book, and thank you
Thank
so
you
much
very
for
much.
joining us.
No, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
This is in a line that you write in the introduction itself, that Hedgewar's influence is everywhere in modern India and nowhere in India's collective memory. Now, one way to understand this is, of course, through the widely made argument that Indian history so far has not given enough space to people who belong to the intellectual right. But why do you think there has been, in the last few years at least, interest academically and otherwise in Savarkar and not so much in Hedgewar nevertheless?
I think if I can take it from two approaches. The first part, you said that not enough space has been given to some of this. You see, in 1947, history is written by the victors. Those that captured the state, Nehru's Congress, right? There were many Congresses, but Nehru's Congress captured the state. Nehru's vision of nation building was around a strong state, centralized state, socialism, and therefore control, right? Also control of information, control of education, and therefore for Nehru, anything that did not fit with his vision of the nation had to be carved out, had to be curtailed. And so there was no space in those days for anyone like a Hedgewarian thought or Hedgewar himself.
But why do you think Savarkar is more
Well,
appealing?
no, even Savarkar was sidelined in
Of
those
course,
days.
of course. I'm talking
Then
about
what
the last
happens
few
is,
years.
but see, now what's happened over the last few decades is that, you see, and this is my point about RSS, is now woven into the social fabric of this country, right? I can't go, as a Brit, I cannot go into any nook or cranny in this country and not bump into something to do with the RSS. That is phenomenal. Now, what that's done is that means the RSS has built social capital, nodes of social capital all over the country, from tribal villages to corporate business houses. And essentially, these nodes have all resulted in the capture of the political state. So the BJP is a politically nationalist organization. The RSS is a culturally nationalist organization. And here people get confused again too. But because the RSS has become so strong that the BJP is able now to capture the state, at least in the center, and they're able to then rebuild the country in their image, suddenly there is now space for Savarkar, for Hedgewar, for many of the other thinkers and philosophers and revolutionaries that maybe would not have found space under the Nehruvian view of the world. So these are natural tectonic shifts that are slowly occurring, and every now and then, like in 2014, you get a jolt. So we think, oh my God, the jolt has happened. But actually, if you study what's been happening from 1947 to 2014, the RSS, as far as I can see, has only gone in one direction, which has got bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. So it's inevitable that at some point their influence was going to reach the state, which Hedgewar knew. Hedgewar in 1930s was very clear. If you did build the social capital and build the Rashtra, you will eventually get to the state anyway. And that makes him unique compared to all of his contemporaries who felt that you have to capture the state.
I know this was a question I was going to ask later in the conversation, but you also mentioned about how it was in 1924 that Hedgewar first read Savarkar's Hindutva, and he was influenced by it greatly. It sort of gave him a means to crystallize the thoughts that he had had for many decades before that. Yet there have been and there continue to be differences between Savarkar and the RSS. How do you see those differences? What are those differences for our viewers, and how do you see them?
Sure, sure. Now, I've come to learn that these are sensitive topics. They need not be, in my view. And so in the book, I cover it. You see, Savarkar, uh, in his essay, Hindutva, he gives what I call the intellectual scaffolding for Hedgewar to internalize and conceptualize his own experiences and his own ideas. So to that end, Vinayak Savarkar was the person who gave him the intellectual lexicon to construct his worldview. Having said that, was Hedgewar close to Vinayak Savarkar? Not particularly. Hedgewar was very close to his younger brother, Narayan Savarkar, because they studied together. Yeah. And he was also very close to his older brother, Ganesh Savarkar, who was actually, they were very good friends. But Vinayak Savarkar, not so much. And Vinayak Savarkar was a political nationalist. He wanted to capture the state. For him, it was about the Hindus capturing the state, unifying the geographical boundaries of India, and then defining the state as a Hindu state.
In fact, Savarkar was also very disdainful of the means of the RSS,
Correct.
Which he saw as very effeminate and...
Correct. So we know in 1939, for example, that their differences, Savarkar and his followers publicized. I mean, they wrote in the Maratha, they wrote in these newspapers of the time, dismissing the RSS. And what they effected, there's a chapter in the book called Not Fascist Enough, where basically Dr. Hedgewar is accused of not being patriotic enough. Why are you not supporting the Hindu Mahasabha?
Yeah.
Right? Now, that's a myth, because a myth in the sense of everybody says the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS were the same thing. Not true.
Of course not.
The RSS most certainly was an independent organization. Savarkar would have liked to have co-opted the RSS. Subhash Chandra Bose would have liked to co-opted the RSS. But Hedgewar was very clear.
Savarkar even tried to create an RSS-like organization.
Yes. His own parallel group afterwards. Didn't work. For Hedgewar, again, this makes him unique amongst his contemporaries, is that he saw that his solution to the Indian problem was the Rashtra, the people. The people were the problems. You had to rebuild the capacity of the people. And that could not be done by the Rajya, the state. Everybody else felt the other way around. Capture the state, then we'll do everything else. And so here, again, just like Gandhi on the other side of the spectrum, on this side of the spectrum, you had Savarkar. Now, that is not to say that they didn't respect each other. In fact, they immensely respected each other, because even after these public rifts, Hedgewar invites Savarkar to give the keynote address at his officers' training camp in 1939. So you can clearly see that there was... and look, I think here, I have to say, India should learn from these kind of differences. You have to be able to discuss with the person who you disagree with, and you have to be able to talk. You have to be able to respect each other. And I think that atmosphere where I can agree to disagree with you and still be friends, I think it's incredible. I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah. I want to get into the mind of Hedgewar the child. You write about how Hedgewar, of course, lost his parents to plague, and he was orphaned at the age of 12. These were also times that India was systematically being deindustrialized, so it was incredibly poor at the time. The British were extremely oppressive in even how they sort of dealt with famines or with the plague itself. Basically, you write about how they were putting people in death camps, even at the at any mild instance of illness. How did all of this, losing his parents, this sort of seeing death all around, seeing poverty all around, this kind of oppression, how did that change or transform the mental makeup of Hedgewar?
It's a great question. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand how would that kind of childhood trauma shape a human being as they matured. You and I can appreciate, and anybody can appreciate, that a child losing both of his parents on the same day through to disease, would have incredible trauma on that child. Couple that with the fact that his older brother, so Hedgewar would have been 12, his older brother would have been 18, 19 at the time, didn't respond so well. He struggled to cope with that trauma and took on alcohol addiction, and sadly he died very young. And so you can see the tragedy unfold. You touched on the fact that Hedgewar, I believe, grew up at a time, as did all these other people, but Hedgewar particularly grew up at a time where it seems like Indian society had hit a what I would call a civilizational low, right? You only had, amongst males, literacy rates of 10%. Amongst women, it was 1%. So highly illiterate society. The number of men who could speak English was about 3%. And so by Hedgewar, then at the age of 12, being adopted by Munjay, which is again underrated and we don't talk about it enough.
I wanted to ask about him.
So Munjay becomes a huge influence on Hedgewar because it suddenly gives him access to the best education India could have. It suddenly gives him an elite upbringing, elite exposure. And so couple the destitution of the Indian society, the deindustrialized Indian society. You then get an adopted father figure like Munjay, who is a product of British education, fought in the Boer Wars, military officer, medical doctor, who then has this huge influence on the young Keshav. So you can now see that Hedgewar becomes a young man who goes from a very low, poor, poor middle class family, Brahmin boy, to a very adopted son of a very affluent, British educated, elite young man into a family, who then gets a fusion of both. So on the one hand, he's fluent in his Sanskrit, in his Marathi, Manobodh, Dasbodh, he's absorbing all these traditional texts. On the other hand, he's reading Greek philosophy. We know that. We know that he consumed Marx. We know that he was consuming Nietzsche. We knew that he was reading Mazzini. So he's having these Enlightenment thinkers, these radical philosophers of Europe also being infused in him. So Hedgewar, it was a highly, well-read. By the time he matured as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, Hedgewar was a fusion of elite British European education and Indian upbringing and Orthodox education. And that puts him again in a unique space compared to his contemporaries.
This was again a question that I wanted to come to at later, but I do want to ask you that since he was the first in his family to study English, his father was extremely reluctant about it while he was alive, but he was reading all these texts and he was reading all these philosophers and political thinkers, but other than the fact that he was just reading these texts in English medium, how do you think English education and him opening up to this world, to the Western world, how did that transform him?
You see, my contention is that he seems to, by the way, have loved English. He seems to have enjoyed the English language.
Yeah, you mentioned he was devouring English literature.
And his prose, even when he speaks, when he does speak in English, Hedgewar's prose is elite. And I don't think people appreciate that, right? I don't think people appreciate that. So Hedgewar not just consumed English literature and English philosophy in English, but it gave him exposure to a global viewpoint. He went from localism to globalism. And I don't think we appreciate how much power English language gave to a young man in that time in history, where, as I say, highly illiterate society. So it's one thing to be literate. It's a very elite thing to then be able to be fluent and speak what I would consider the Queen's English. At that time, you're going to have exposure. You're going to be exposed to things that you otherwise would never have.
But we also do know that literature from the West and was of course, one, it was colonial in nature. It was also Orientalist literature, which was on many occasions very disdainful of Indian society, of even Hindu society. Do you think it's possible that he internalized some of the critiques that were being made in that literature about the Hindu society? For example, Hindu society being in a state of decline?
So, so really interesting. I think, look, I think he would have certainly come across uh, English narratives that were pejorative
Yeah.
towards Indian culture, Indian society. No doubt. No doubt he knew about Macaulay. No doubt that he would have read a lot of the tenets that were coming out of the church, right, of that time. And remember, if you were, in fact, many church theologians at that time looked at India, and I think I say this in chapter 2 of the book.
Yeah.
If you were a churchman looking at India in the 1910 period, you would have thought this is the end of a civilization. Famine, death, war, pestilence, social degradation, deindustrialization, mass destitution. You'd have thought this is the end of a society. So he would have consumed a lot of these narratives. But remember that Hedgewar was also infused with the stories of Shivaji from a very young age. He was infused with with the texts of Das Bodh or Mano Bodh. I mean, these are profound pieces of literature from his own traditions, from his own culture. So actually, I suspect what would have happened is because he was exposed to the Indian culture first, it in some ways would have inoculated him from then some of these latter influences from the West to a degree. The other side to it is, remember that not all the criticisms about Indian society was wrong. Hedgewar was critical enough, right? What we would call Vivek in modern speak. He had the Vivek, the ability to discriminate between, look, this is a critique from an outsider, but this is the reality as I see it. And they match. The fact that the caste system was a disaster for Indian civilization over the last 500 years is something that he didn't need the West to tell him. He knew. He could see the backwardness of the women in his society. He could see it. And he saw real examples of the patriarchy or the patriarchal world that Indian society had become. So he didn't need the West to tell him these things. I think by living in those times, by being part of a wave of the plague, by seeing the kind of abject poverty that he would have seen on his doorstep, I think he knew. And he saw it even more so when he went to university and he saw the power of the British, that actually Indian society has a problem.
And I think you write about this, and I want to quote you for the when you mention this. You say that he had been exposed to British engineering, the height of bureaucracy, the discipline with which they operated, their music, art, and above else, their thirst for knowledge through science. So you see a change, a transformation that happens within Hedgewar from seeing the British as just oppressors to people who he actually looks up to. Some can also call it identification with the oppressor. How do you see that?
I think that is too far. I think, look, I think, let's be clear. Hedgewar spent his entire life and risking his life to fight the British and the British tyranny, right? So let's be clear that Hedgewar knew that India was being subjected to despotism and to tyranny. The British were the tyrants. But he also wanted to understand the nature of the tyranny, the nature of the tyrant. And so I call the British the Leviathan. If you notice in the book, I use the word Leviathan. Why the Leviathan? Because a Leviathan is a force. It's not people, the British were not a thing. The British were a force. And that force was tyrannical. And Hedgewar wants to understand the nature of the tyranny. And to understand the nature of tyranny, you have to also see the tyranny. And so he sees that this tyranny uses sophisticated bureaucracy, law, the rule of law. It uses technology, right? It uses industrialization. At the same time, deindustrializing the locals. So he sees all of these things. Now, that's not to say identify. That's just to say you see the wood from the trees. You see the reality as it appears to you. And I think, again, that makes him incredibly unique. That he was able to see this. He could see and identify the nature of the tyranny and then think, how do we undo this tyranny? And that's where, again, his cultural nationalism comes into play. What he realized by watching the British is that you could not defeat the British with guns and bombs. You could not defeat the British economically. You had to first look at your own society and say, my God, we don't have the foundations, the building blocks of building an innovative society. And let me just dwell on this. You'll find this interesting. My argument is, one of the reasons why Hedgewar loathed caste, he absolutely loathed it. Why? Because he recognized by watching the British that for all of the British tyranny and oppression on the Indians, what they did do very well was that they were obsessed with this idea of understanding nature, knowledge, technology, etc. And what he saw in Indian society was that effectively caste had fossilized in Indian society. How it happened is a different issue, but it happened. And the fossilization of caste meant that social mobility had come to a standstill. Without social mobility in a society, you can't get innovation. And without innovation, no society can develop. He saw this by reflecting on the British. He saw the Indian predicament that much more clearly. Now, that's an incredible realization to have. And I think we have to give credit where credit is due, that Hedgewar manages to create this worldview and then produce a solution that we are talking about 100 years later.
Yeah. I want to go back in time, and I think I personally found this very interesting. You wonder in the book that if the loss of his parents at a very young age led him to have a sort of aversion or inability to having intimate relationships. Um, and of course, we know that he was a celibate. The RSS values celibacy as one of its core tenets. Um, do you think Hedgewar valuing celibacy was a projection of his own inability to form intimate relationships because of his childhood trauma, or did he see pragmatic value in it?
Gosh, look, firstly, let's untangle some of that, right? As far as I can see, the RSS doesn't value celibacy. As far as I can see, the RSS is projecting people to have more babies, right?
No,
And have more children.
I mean within the organization for pracharaks.
Okay.
Very specifically.
Exactly. So
Very
we have to.
specifically.
Again, we have to be linguistically hygienic, right? So if we be linguistically hygienic, the pracharak order, and I call it an order. I think to call pracharaks full-time volunteers is a huge, not just disservice to them, but actually it does us wrong because we don't understand who they are. The pracharak order is akin to the friars of medieval Europe. The friars of medieval Europe were men, mostly, who had taken vows, and what psychologists today would call the devoted actor, where one's self-interest, one's sense of self, is merged completely with an idea, with a mission. These were the friars of medieval Europe that expanded the church everywhere, all across the world. That same sense of mission, that same sense of devoted actor, is the pracharak order. So within the order, celibacy is valued.
Yeah.
Why? For no other reason than you have no other vested interests. You become the devoted actor because there is nothing to distract you from fulfilling and completing the Hedgewarian mission, right? So yes, within the order, that is certainly the case. Now, to answer your second point, which was that, do we think that this may be a reflection of the trauma he went through? I certainly think that he himself, and it's a conjecture, I'm only conjecturing, obviously, who can answer it for sure, but as a conjecture, a trauma like that would have certainly meant having those close, intimate relationships would have made it difficult. One. Number two, though, we forget this bit, and this is the more interesting bit I find. I think, and I'm conjecturing, but it's worth the conjecture, one of the reasons why he doesn't marry is that he sees the condition of widows in Indian society. And it's not good. It's bad, very bad. And so he realizes that while he's at a maritable age, he's a doctor, so he's a very eligible bachelor. He's 6'2", built like a wrestler. So he's a imposing figure, and he doesn't get married, one of the reasons could be that he sees this condition of widows. And let's remember something. He, at that time, was at the sharp end of the independence struggle. Huh? He was not a politician giving a good talk. He was smuggling guns. He was smuggling arms. If in that moment the Leviathan had got hold of him, he would have faced the gallows.
Correct, yeah.
And I think we should take a pause and just take that in for a minute. Here was a man in his young 20s, eligible for marriage, become a doctor, but was running guns and arms, smuggling. One of the most dangerous things you could do in India at that time. So he, I think, takes a calculated view of the world. And he says, look, I see the condition of widows of my fellow revolutionaries who've been hung or who've been incarcerated for so many years. I mean, just look at what happened to the families of those freedom fighters who were thrown into Andaman jail, and what happened? They faced destitution. So I think Hedgewar takes a calculated, pragmatic view that if I want to commit myself to the freedom struggle, there was no RSS at the time, there was no cultural nationalism.
Yeah.
If I want to dedicate myself to a violent struggle, there is no room to then commit to a woman that I can love and have a family with, because it would be irresponsible of him. He may be having a pretty short life.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a calculation that Hedgewar seems to have made. Now, it's a conjecture, but I think it's a powerful conjecture.
You write in the book that Keshav Hedgewar and his young friends, and I think this is before he loses his parents, he and his young friends would play something called Protect the Flag, right? With a certain amount of militancy,
Yes.
you say. And the theme was always to save the Bhagwa Dhwaj, which is the saffron flag, from the invading Islamic forces. So I want to ask you, how did Hedgewar's attention turn from the British to the Muslims? And this is also to ask, how did the idea of an uninterrupted continuum of oppression form and get crystallized in his mind?
So again, I will just untangle some of that. Let's flip it first. So the British come much later.
Of course, he's reading Shivaji.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is a 14-year-old
Yeah.
young Keshav, right? Who after school goes for a swim in the local lake, and then goes up this hill where the British houses were, or administration was, on the hills. And there is the Hanuman Mandir, and then outside the Hanuman Mandir is where they play these games after school. So it's very innocent in that sense. It's very idyllic, you know, in that sense of the world. And so the British and political nationalism and all this stuff doesn't exist in his mind, right? He's a young
But he
14-year-old
is
boy.
in that condition. He is in a colonial condition.
Correct. But it's not. Remember, we forget again. We don't quite appreciate. If you were living in Nagpur at the time when Hedgewar is 12, 13, 14, you would hardly see a white face anywhere. Most Indians never even met or saw a white person. Yet Indians knew, at least in urban India, they knew that some force, external force, was ruling their country. But on the whole, an Indian wouldn't have even seen a white person, a single white person, right? So the British, this Leviathan, that's why I call it the Leviathan. It's a force. So Hedgewar would not have seen a white person. I would say by the time he was 12 or 13, he would have seen a raft of the British and English people only when he got to university in Calcutta. So that's one thing. So actually, this whole thing comes out of Shivaji, his exposure to Shivaji, right? And that time frame. We have to understand that within the Maratha culture, within the Maharashtrian culture at that time, especially amongst his community, Shivaji was kind of staple diet. If you could read and write, you were going to be exposed to the great king Shiva Bhosle, right? You were. So he was like any other literate boy at that time who was consuming this literature, most likely in Marathi and maybe Hindi. And maybe a quite a eulogized form of Shivaji as well. And of course, who was Shivaji predominantly fighting against? The Mughal Empire and imperialism of the Mughals. So Hedgewar would have automatically had that exposure, number one. Number two is this thing about the gamification of these things. So again, if you look at his upbringing, the Hedgewars had a tradition of being wrestlers. His father, older brother, him, they were all wrestlers, fighting, gym, the akhara. They had an akhara in the home.
Yeah.
So playing rough, tough games
Mm.
was just part of their milieu,
Mm.
right? It was just something they would have absorbed without thinking about it.
Mm.
So that's the world he grew up in. But I think the idea of the continuum thing about the civilization, I suspect would have come from his father and his uncles and that community he belonged to, where I think through the shlokas and the mantras and manobodh and dasbodh and all of these sorts of things, he would have, without being maybe able to articulate it at that age, he would have known or felt that I am part of something old. I am part of something very, very old, that what I'm seeing around me is not what it was many, many hundreds of years ago. I don't think he could have created a historical philosophy out of it for you or a narrative out of it for you. But I think he would have known that much, that I am part of something much older.
Yeah.
And what's happening around me is not natural.
You know, the late 20th century and early 21st century, they're so crucial in understanding politics of our times. I don't think people appreciate it as much. But this was a time of many reform movements across religions, across communities. You had the Brahmo Samaj, you had the Arya Samaj, you had the Aligarh Muslim movement, you had the Singh Sabha movement among the Sikhs. RSS also gets formed around this time in 1925. Why do you think what do you think is the core difference between the RSS and these other reform movements, and why do you think the RSS has kind of been one of the more successful of these movements, which continues till date?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think there are two things I'll say. One is the genius of Hedgewar.
Hmm.
And let me be unapologetic about that. I think Hedgewar was unique amongst his contemporaries because he could see things way beyond the sight of some of his contemporaries, including Patel, Ambedkar, Gandhi, Savarkar. I think Hedgewar saw a very long vision, and I think he diagnosed not just the problem very well, he seems to have given a very effective solution. So that's number one. Number two is the Pracharak order. Look at all of these movements. They were all ring fenced by caste or creed, so religion, right, or class. All of them. They all were somehow pigeonholed into one thing or the other, right? Then take the RSS. Hedgewar from day one argues there is no caste, there is no class, and there is no creed. Desh Bhakti is the red line, as in the line upon which we will build everything, the cultural nationalism. So that makes the RSS incredibly unique and incredibly broad and able to absorb the diversity and the variety of Indian society, which it still today, by the way, is still grappling with, is still doing. The reason why the RSS keeps on growing, no matter what, is because fundamentally the Hedgewarian seed that Indian society must transgress caste, class, and creed is its secret recipe.
I want to ask you about his years behind bars. It was in the early 20s, right before he forms the RSS, that he was imprisoned, and you describe what the condition was like. You describe it as a rat-infested, foul-smelling cell where he was. Now, tell me something for a Brahmin, who, especially someone like Hedgewar, who valued cleanliness so much, also because of his experience of the plague, of losing his parents to the plague, and so on. How did his time in the prison change him? And I'm asking this also in comparison with Savarkar, because we do know that Savarkar's time in the prison and the torture that was inflicted upon him changed his views considerably. So, how did the years in prison change Hedgewar?
Yeah, no, I think again, super question, and I spent a bit of time. I did dedicate a whole chapter to that period. So I think a couple of things. I think the RSS hagiographies window dress this period, and they make it sound as if he just took it in his stride and he came out the other end.
Yeah.
And I think the line they use is he came out a few kilograms heavier. What a man. Sort of. The reality is something very different. Prison life was tough, and you have to understand something about the Hedgewarian thought. Hedgewar works at the level of the grassroots society. So as a political prisoner, he had the opportunity, because political prisoners during this colonial period were treated differently to other prisoners. Even in prison, there was class and caste, even in prison. Hedgewar could have used his congressman ticket and said, I want my own cell, I like to have my own books, and, have that. And by the way, most political prisoners, including Gandhi, Nehru, etc., yeah, they spent time in prison. But it was a very different prison to the one I describe, right? Hedgewar chooses to be treated just like any other prisoner. This is a soft point that everybody misses. He chooses this. Why does he choose this? Because I think even though the RSS hasn't been formed, his critique of Hindu society is now very mature by the time 1921 comes along. In 1921, Hedgewar already knows the problem with Hindu society is exactly this issue, that there are too many ruptures of class and caste and creed within Hindu society, within Indian society at large.
But it also creates a certain degree of trauma, I can imagine, which would manifest
100%.
in ways that
So I'm
would
coming to
not
that.
sometimes be very nice as well.
100%. I'm coming to that. So, for example, he comes in, and I describe what an average day in prison would have looked like for Hedgewar, right? It's pretty brutal. I mean, it's pretty rough. So I agree with you that I think he comes out of prison a changed man, and I say that as much. I think he's convinced. I think prison is the moment where really the formation of cultural nationalism takes root. He moves away gradually from political nationalism to cultural nationalism.
Because he was in the Congress himself.
Correct. He felt he had already abandoned the violent revolutionary stuff. He thought that wouldn't work. He became a political nationalist and joined the Congress and really became an activist. But in prison, I think he realizes that actually political nationalism won't work either. The problem is much deeper, and we need what now we call cultural nationalism. Those seeds were planted in prison, I think, during that time. Also remember, when he was in prison, something rather tragic happened to the Indian society. In 1921, you had the Mapilla, and as a euphemism, they call it riots. They were not riots, they were a massacre, and I think we should be clear about that in our history. The Mapilla massacres that occurred in 1921, even though he was in prison at the time, Munje was writing regularly to him, describing what was going on, and Munje was on the ground with what was going on. I think that also traumatized Hedgewar to say, I can see what is coming, the ruptures that are coming within Indian society. So I think these things were very powerful moments in that time.
A couple of questions. His model of the shakhas, and I think what this book really helped me do is understand and appreciate more holistically how much the RSS is cast in Hedgewar's sort of image itself in a way, even though that's not something he wanted. But for example, you mentioned about how akharas were a very core part of his upbringing, and then he comes up with this absolutely unique model of the shakha. How does this model come to his mind? What was its important significance?
You see, the shakha is what I call the node upon which social capital is built, what Robert Putnam calls social capital. I think Hedgewarian thought, Hedgewarian philosophy is completely rooted in the shakha, and it's rooted in building. The whole thing is designed to build social capital. Let me just quickly explain. The shakha is gamification, right? Today we call it gamification, but basically what it did was he gamified cultural nationalism. He gamified it. He didn't create books. He didn't write speeches. What he clocked onto was that the Indian mind is so simple. Indian mind is so illiterate. It is so emotive. It is so rooted in its past that there was no point preaching to it. He saw over and over again how people get excited for a few minutes and then they whimper. He said, how do we build robustness in the Indian mind, in the Indian character? He felt that the Indian character was the problem. So he gamified it. Through gamification, daily exposure, character building, through gaming, through playing games, you could reform the character of an individual. You could build brotherhood within the RSS because there were no women, so you could build brotherhood. That brotherhood is another way of saying social capital. That social capital creates a surplus of trust. When you have a surplus of trust, you can innovate. You can change the things around you. You become a center of trust. and solidarity. So in a society that is highly fragmented, you started to get these nodes that through gamification, I mean, how low are the barriers to entry? Just come and play. We don't care your caste, we don't care your class, we don't care about your religion, your creed. Come and play games with us. Come and play games. So now by playing games, you reduce the barriers to entry. You play games, but through the games, without even thinking about it, you're picking up values, you're picking up character, courage, bravery, so on and so forth. And so that is truly social engineering at its highest. And to this day, by the way, my contention is that the RSS's strength
Is the shakha.
is the shakha. It's that social node of social capital.
Sachin, this has been such a fascinating conversation. There are so many questions I still have, and I think we can talk about it later as well. But to all those who are as curious as I am to ask more questions to Sachin, please do pick up this book. It's an absolutely thrilling read. It's an extremely breezy book to read. Thank you so much, Sachin. And I think the sort of value of this book is kind of giving a psychological / psychoanalytic lens into Hedgewar's mind, and I think we don't do that enough with political figures. So congratulations for the book
Thank you
once
so much
again.
for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank
You
you
very much.